Chris Hedges, in your most recent book, The World as It Is, Dispatches on the Myth on human Progress, you write, brace yourself, the American empire is over, and the descent is going to be horrifying. How did you come to that conclusion?
Well, first of all, I spent 20 years on the outer reaches of empire as a foreign correspondent. So I've seen an aspect of empire that most people have not, unless you're in the military or perhaps the foreign service. And I think all of the red signs, the sort of red warning signs are there. I think also the fact that I spent so long outside the United States gave me a kind of perspective when I returned. I understood how radically the country had changed in the 2 decades that I was away. I think for those who had remained within the borders of the United States, those changes had been more incremental and perhaps less perceptible.
What are some of the symptoms, the signs that the American empire is over?
The biggest sign is the fact that we are following the trajectory of all empires, which is that they expand beyond their capacity to sustain themselves. We have run up the largest deficits in human history, which in the bottom line is we can't repay it. We have done so at the cost of our infrastructure, our public education, our working class. We're hollowing the country out from the inside, and the physical evidence is all around us, plunging roughly 1/3 of Americans into poverty or near poverty, according to the latest statistics. Our bridges, our roads are collapsing, libraries are being closed, fire stations are being closed. These are the signs of a nation, or let's call it an empire, that is reaching a kind of a terminal point. And if we don't radically rechart our course, then the collapse is going to be very frightening and very chaotic.
In Empire of Illusion, which you wrote and published in 2009, you write, "Those captive to images cast ballots based on how candidates make them feel. They vote for a slogan, a smile, perceived sincerity and attractiveness, along with the carefully crafted personal narrative of the candidate. It is style and story, not content and fact, that inform mass politics."
Precisely, and the structure of the corporate state, as well as the imperial state, remains untouched. It doesn't really matter which political party holds office. The policies of George W. Bush have been assiduously carried out for the large part by Barack Obama. And even figures like Dick Cheney have confirmed this, whether it is the so-called war on terror, the refusal to restore habeas corpus, the eavesdropping, wiretapping, and monitoring of tens of millions of Americans, which under our Constitution should be illegal, passed for the FISA Reform Act, which Barack Obama supported, whether it is the looting of the U.S. Treasury on behalf of Wall Street. All of these are policies which are bipartisan. And that is because we have undergone, I think, in the last few decades, a kind of slow-motion coup d'etat, a corporate coup d'etat, whereby the citizen is rendered impotent, and it is solely the interests of corporations which are paramount within the circles of the power elite. I mean, one could take many examples, but Obamacare would be a good one. I share the right wing's critique of Obamacare. It's a disastrous bill. It was written by corporate lobbyists, 2,000 pages of it. It is essentially the equivalent of the bank bailout bill for the pharmaceutical and insurance industry, $400 billion in subsidies. Meanwhile, the White House handed out exemptions because these corporations do not want to insure chronically ill children. I mean, think of it in moral terms. It really means that we live in a country where it is now legally permissible for corporations, for-profit corporations, to hold sick children hostage while their parents frantically bankrupt themselves trying to save their sons or daughters. This is the kind of world the corporate state creates. And the Democrats and the Republicans are both handmaidens of corporate interests, which is why Congress has such a low approval rating. I mean, the American public's not fooled by this.
In 2010, Death of the Liberal Class came out. Here's a quote, "The election of Obama was one more triumph of illusion over substance. It was a skillful manipulation and betrayal of the public by a corporate power elite. We mistook style and ethnicity an advertising tactic pioneered by Calvin Klein and Benetton for progressive politics and genuine change.
Sure, Obama functioned as a brand. Now remember, 2008, the financial collapse, Wall Street was terrified. They thought they'd been found out. They thought they would have to pay a price for their criminal activity, fraudulent activity, and malfeasance. And Obama functioned as a brand in the same way that people of color or HIV-positive models were used by Benetton and Calvin Klein to associate their products with a risque lifestyle and progressive politics. But as with the function of all brands, we confused a brand with an experience. Obama won Advertising Age's top annual award, Marketer of the Year, because the professionals knew precisely what he had done. He beat Nike, Apple, Zappos. And that's what he was. He, to quote Cornel West, became essentially a black mascot for Wall Street.
One of the themes in a lot of your books is criticism of liberals. Why?
Because the liberal class was never meant to function as the political left. The liberal class was meant to function as the political center. And I spent a lot of time in Death of the Liberal Class going back to the radical and populist movements at the turn of the century, which were very powerful. Anarcho-syndicalist unions like the Wobblies, the old CIO, Eugene Debs, the socialist candidate for president, polled almost 6% of the vote, 900,000 votes in 1912. Publications like Appeal to Reason and the Masses, which were socialist publications, had wide circulations. Appeal to Reason was the fourth most widely read periodical in the country at the time before the war. And we had about 2 or 3 dozen socialist mayors. Well, what happened was the war itself. And Wilson had run for re-election in 1912 on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." But with the collapse of the Eastern Front, with Tsarist Russia, the collapse of Tsarist Russia and the Bolshevik Revolution, there was the capacity of the Germans to send, I think, upwards of 100 divisions to the Western Front. And the bankers on Wall Street, who had lent tremendous sums of money to the British and the French, were terrified that if the British and French lost the war, they'd lose their money. So there was heavy pressure on the White House, aided by the Kaiser's decision to begin to try and create a naval blockade around Britain, which sank 3 or 4 American ships, to go into the war. But it had no popular support. And we created, and I spent a lot of time writing about this in Death of the Liberal Class, the first system of modern mass propaganda, the Committee for Public Information, known as popularly as the Creel Commission, because it was headed by a figure named George Creel. Now, the Committee for Public Information and the sort of dark figure, the Grand Inquisitor type figure, becomes Walter Lippmann, who ends up writing a Public Opinion in 1922, sort of the blueprint for control. Manufacturing consent is his phrase. And it's how you use propaganda effectively to manufacture consent. And you don't actually need the harsher measures of the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, except for the most recalcitrant forces or radical forces. Randolph Bourne, Jane Addams, Debs himself ends up going to prison. But propaganda becomes, in the right hands, in the hands of the state, a much more effective tool to herd people where you want them. And the most important thing about the Committee for Public Information is that it drew on the understanding of crowd psychology or mass psychology pioneered by figures like Le Bon, Trotter, and of course Sigmund Freud. That people were not moved by fact or reason, but manipulated by emotion. And this system of mass propaganda, which created a kind of permanent fear of course, the Hun, was transferred the moment the war was over to the dreaded Red. And there's a great writer I like very much, Dwight MacDonald, who writes of this period, and he said, essentially the war, World War I, was the rock on which these movements broke. Now, this is absolutely vital to understanding what happened to American democracy, because these movements never took formal political power, and yet they were the true correctives to in terms of opening up our democracy. The Liberty Party that fought slavery, the suffragists, the labor movement, later the civil rights movement. These were movements that pressured the liberal class to respond. We saw perhaps the best example of it during the Great Depression, where you had figures like Roosevelt and his vice president, Henry Wallace. And these were liberals who responded to the plight of the underclass and made incremental and piecemeal